Hello, everyone. This is Grant Callen with Empower Mississippi, and welcome to another edition of Coffee and Conversation. Today, our conversation is about criminal justice reform, and I'm delighted to be joined by Alabama Republican State Senator Cam Ward, who serves as the chairman of the Alabama State Judiciary Committee. Welcome to the conversation, Senator.
Thanks for having me on today.
Well, our two states, Alabama and Mississippi, share many great things in common: good food, good football. We also share some challenges. And specifically, I want to talk to you today about our prison crises and the U.S. Justice Department, who has investigated both of our states' prison systems. And you penned a column recently that ran in a number of Mississippi papers offering Alabama as a cautionary tale for Mississippi, really for what not to do in response to a Justice Department investigation. So let's open up talking about that. What did you mean by that?
Well, if you look at the history of our two states, we both unfortunately have a history with federal intervention as well as Justice Department oversight looking into our system. We both have a history, Alabama, particularly in the late 1970s and 1980s, when we were taken over by the federal court and put in receivership. And then again in the 2000s and 2016, 17, and 18, 19, and 20, we've had DOJ and the federal courts investigating our system. And so Mississippi has similar challenges. You have an overcrowded system and one that's just, you can't build your way out of it. And many states, including both of ours in the past, have tried to deal with the overcrowding problem by building, and both states failed when we did that. But yet we spent a whole lot of money that could probably be invested in a way that's much better for the criminal justice system.
So what led to Alabama's investigation?
We have one of the more overcrowded systems in the country, and we also have a great deal of violence on the inside, inmate on inmate violence, officer on inmate violence, and the deteriorating conditions inside those facilities and a marked uptick in violence is what really led to the investigation. Not only the conditions, but also the health care and mental health care of the correction system here.
And what did they find?
Well, they found we violated the Eighth Amendment when it came to the health care that we provided for our inmates. There's also been an ADA complaint, which we were able to comply with and get rectified. But we still are ongoing in litigation on the mental health aspect. And the Department of Justice, on their own, separate from the federal courts, has released 2 reports regarding the violence inside the system and the need to do something to abate that problem.
And did your legislature do anything in response to it while they were searching?
Well, we did some stuff in 2015. We started working on a package in 2019 with the hopes that in 2020 we'd be able to get something passed. COVID-19, we had about 12 bills that came out of committee. And then when COVID-19 struck, it basically limited the rest of our session to, in essence, a budgetary session. So we now have to wait till either the governor calls us back into a special session, which I don't think will happen because of the COVID-19. I mean, you saw it in the legislature in Mississippi, how tough it can be sometimes having that many people in one place. But I do think when we do go back into regular session in February, it's going to have to be a number one priority that has to be addressed.
Well, and so sort of, what did the Justice Department require of you in terms of federal edicts?
Well, what they want is they basically give us a certain period of time that we have to show some sort of progress or action, or else they're going to file a cripple lawsuit against us. And that's, we've been in this situation before. We were there 2 years ago, and we're here again. They're just their patience is running out. So what they're trying to do is they're laying out the markers of what we need to address. And now they're waiting for us to show that we're serious about it. If we don't show we're serious, they're going to join probably the other in federal court. We're already losing anyway.
So your column mentioned it could require up to $2 billion in new spending.
Yeah, you could do. I mean, there's no telling, and that's over long term. But I mean, right now our annual corrections budget here is about 560, not quite. It's between 560 and $600 million. But over a period of time, between new facilities you're going to have to build, between update on mental health care, as well as other programming issues inside the facilities, hiring new officers over a period of 3 or 4 years. Yeah, you're looking at up to $2 billion in new taxpayer money going just to corrections.
Well, so, I mean, you look at these situations in your state or ours, there's really only two solutions. You can either spend a whole lot more money, or you can actually lower the population.
Yeah, well, what you can do, yeah, that's just your choice. And we're both poor states. We both have a lot of social services that our citizens need, whether it be Medicaid, which is a big part of both of our budgets, whether it be law enforcement for public safety, whether it be other services in general that people need, public education. But you have a choice. And really and truly, if you look at the models around the country, what you're seeing is if you just keep growing your population and you don't change your habits, you're going to keep having the same problems. And both of our states have a history of showing that. So what we have to do is we've got to add a reentry and rehabilitative element to our correction system. You've got to do something on that front if you really not only one want to deal with your overcrowding, but two, if you want to reduce recidivism, that's another proven means of getting there.
But how do we do that? I mean, we've been talking about that for a long time, and it seems like it's hard to actually pass those bills because, to some degree, you got members that feel like, if you're doing criminal justice reform, you're somehow soft on crime, or you're going to let dangerous people out. But that's not what you're talking about, right?
No, not at all. And I think Governor Bryant even spoke about this a couple of times to some national organizations when he was governor of Mississippi on the need for example, workforce training. I think conservatives and liberals alike can agree that training someone to get a job skill while they're incarcerated is going to be a positive step toward them being rehabilitated, not committing a crime again. I mean, the data shows overwhelmingly that someone who leaves prison and they have a certificate, a job certificate, and are able to locate a stable job, they don't commit crimes. They don't come back. And I think that's something that's a bipartisan support. I mean, don't we want everyone to have a job and work and pay their taxes and be a productive member of society, not hurt someone? That's a no-brainer. So workforce training should be at the top of anyone's list. I do think you have to look at what you do on supervision when someone's released. Again, 95% of your population eventually is going to leave the prison system. So they need adequate supervision through parole officers, making sure they're also getting their programming. If there's a mental illness, they're getting the treatment they need. If there's an addiction, they're getting the treatment they need. And that can only be done through proper supervision. And then finally, I would say, at the end of the day, you've got to figure out what you want someone to look like on the outside. And what they look like the day before they're released is exactly what they're going to look like the day after they're released. And you want them to be a person who is rehabilitated, ready for a second chance, and they're out there wanting to make themselves better. But we've got to invest resources in those. That's not free.
So I agree completely. Most of those ideas are sort of on the back end of how do we keep people who do serve their time from going back in. But
correct.
On the front end, do you think we're locking too many people up to begin with?
Yeah, to a degree. Nationally, you're locking too many people up. I mean, it makes us. You got to look at what are you trying to do here. Are you trying to make us feel good by locking them up? Is that the goal here that makes us feel better, or are you actually having public safety? You talk to many of your county sheriffs, and they tell you the same thing. One of the biggest things they see is a rotation in and out of people that are mentally ill. And how do you address those that are mentally ill? How do you address their underlying issue? If you can ever tackle mental health and mental illness, that goes a long way toward resolving those going into the system.
Well, and there's a sense that, I hear from people here say that, people with, maybe it's not mental illness, but it's an addiction issue, that if they go to prison, at least they'll have a chance to dry out. And the truth is, we find out we got more access to illegal substances in prisons than we do out. And so
most of the time, too, mental illness is an underlying issue for the addiction. So there's a mental illness, and that's what causes the addiction. Incarceration, it will not solve that. They get just as many drugs, if not more. They have access to things they don't need. And you also have to look at, your sentencing guidelines. There's a reason for punishment, but the punishment has to be proportionate to the crime. In the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s, in a reaction to the social unrest of the 60s, we went on a huge sentencing spree of basically criminalizing anything we could think of, any behavior that we thought was wrong, regardless of what the proportion of it was. And so we did that. And what we realized was our population boomed over those 3 decades, but the revenue to pay for all those people being incarcerated didn't follow with it. So we liked the idea of them locking them up, throwing away the key, but we didn't want to pay for it. And that's how you found yourself in a situation where you potentially have a violation of the Eighth Amendment.
So do you think long sentences are a greater deterrent over short sentences, or is it just depend?
It depends on the crime. I mean, you look at certain property crimes that we probably overly criminalize sometimes. There's a way to punish, there's no question, and punishment's due when a crime is committed. But there's also a way to punish that's proportionate to the crime committed. I think most of us, when we think of prisons, we think of murderers, rapists, child molesters, and they definitely should be in prison. I think the problem you have is that what the general public doesn't realize is that the vast majority of the people in your state prisons are not falling into one of those categories, yet they're taking up that same valuable bed space. So I think it's proportionate to what the crime is what the punishment should be.
So Mississippi's in a situation similar to where you guys were and are to some degree, where revenue's in short supply. The pandemic has become more of a concern in the prisons because it's a potential for a hot spot with overcrowding. But it's also just made revenues tight to where it's going to be hard to spend new money on things like our prison system. Facing that as a backdrop, and now Mississippi's under investigation by the Department of Justice, what should we do and what should be our sense of urgency?
Well, I think your sense of urgency is you don't want to lose control of your budget. And that happened to Alabama when we were put in receivership. It's happened to California, which is the most expensive example of being put under federal receivership. And that's the eventual end result if you just kind of put your head in the sand and say, I don't want to deal with it. Alabama did that and didn't work. It's never worked. And it won't work now. We keep doing this. The sense of urgency is if you ever go into a federal receivership, you turn over a portion of your budget to the federal courts, and they can dictate to you whatever they want you to spend it on, or if they want you to raise taxes to pay for it, they can force you to raise taxes. It's not a pleasant situation. California today still pays the price for their situation where they just ignore the courts. And we will too if we're not careful.
So we're in a position today where lawmakers still have the ability to make these decisions and craft a reform package for our criminal justice system that they think makes sense. But if you care about teachers getting paid what they ought to be paid, and you care about roads and bridges and all the other things, we're going to cut into that if the federal government comes down and says, no, you will spend new money, and here's how much you'll spend.
Yeah, and you better believe your guys aren't going to they're like Alabama. No one's going to voluntarily raise taxes for prisons. It just doesn't happen. But you can allocate your resources in a way that's better. Looking at some of the reform proposals in Mississippi, you're not reinventing the wheel. Other states have taken on similar measures and they've been successful. And I say other states, I mean conservative states. Georgia, Texas, and North Carolina are all three states that have really done a good job in their criminal justice reform efforts. There are other states around the country, Kentucky, that are looking to do the same things. So you have states that are already on record doing some of the same things you're talking about, and they're conservative states, and they've had good results.
So why is this so hard? It makes common sense. It makes budgetary sense. It's a moral issue that the punishment ought to fit the crime. But why is it so hard to do this in state after state?
Well, the reason being is, the legislature and our executive branch of government are a reflection of the voters that put us there. And you have to educate the public first and foremost on, hey, this is why this is important. And it's not letting a bunch of criminals go unpunished onto the streets to hurt someone. You have to educate the public. Until you do that, a lot of folks in elected office will be like, I don't want to be soft on crime. That's the conversations we have over in Alabama. Well, I don't want the criminals getting out. Everybody's going to think I'm soft on crime. So it's that typical debate that we've faced for, decades now. It's the same debate here.
Well, I hope we will take a different course. I hope we will respond with more urgency than Alabama did. And I think we still have a chance to fix this ourselves, or else somebody else will fix it for us. Any final thoughts?
I've said that same thing all the time. I think you guys are on the right track. I really believe you're on the right track to do the right thing. I think the amount of work that went into that legislation was well thought out. And again, don't ask me to look at the results in other states that have done similar things, and it works. And I think it's a good path forward for Mississippi.
Well, Senator, thank you for your leadership on this issue in Alabama and your help here in Mississippi. And I've enjoyed our conversation.
Thanks for having me. It's a real pleasure.